Cold open, the psychological anchor. The tragedy of Micah Miller, which erupted in the spring of 2024, is not a simple crime story. It is a complex psychological and sociological phenomenon. It exposed the systemic failure of traditional legal frameworks to protect a victim from the invisible violence that leaves no bruises, but completely destroys the personality from the inside. Mica Miller was 30 years old, the vibrant wife of a pastor in South Carolina. Her death became the catalyst for a global discussion on the nature of religious abuse and the urgent need to criminalize coercive control. To understand the trajectory that led to her death, we must first introduce the key concept of communal narcissism. This is the core pathology of the man at the center of this tragedy, Pastor John Paul Miller, or J.P. Miller. Unlike the classic, grandiose narcissist who seeks power through direct dominance, the communal narcissist, or the holy narcissist, feeds his ego through the performance of altruism, piety, and service to the community. J.P. Miller used the religious institution, Solid Rock Ministries, as a stage. He was the star. His congregation was the captive audience, providing the constant, adoring validation, the narcissistic supply that he required. This religious status gave the abuser unique protection. Any criticism leveled against J.P. Miller was instantly reframed not as a personal conflict, but as an attack on the church, or even an attack on God himself. This created a psychological trap for Micah. To speak out against her husband meant automatically speaking out against her entire community and her deepest faith. This is the definition of institutional betrayal. The tragedy of April 27, 2024 was not a sudden act. It was the final, tragic culmination of a decade-long trajectory of systematic psychological warfare. The entire structure of her relationship was a prison.
Act 1. The Paradox of the Victim. To begin our psychological expertise, we must look at the earliest stages of this relationship. This is where we see the first, most dangerous red flags, the asymmetry of power and the pattern of grooming. Micah Francis, born in 1994, was a talented, energetic, and deeply religious young woman. She had a vibrant spirit, which ironically made her a desirable object for control. Her path crossed with John Paul Miller's when she was still a minor. According to her obituary and family statements, they established a friendship around 2009 when Micah was just 14 or 15 years old. J.P. Miller was approximately 30 years old at the time and was married to his first wife, Allison. This asymmetry of power is a critical risk factor. First, the age asymmetry. A 15-year age gap during the most formative years of a teenager's life is fundamentally imbalanced. Micah was an adolescent developing her identity. J.P. Miller was a fully formed adult and a figure of spiritual authority. Second, the status asymmetry. J.P. Miller was a pastor. He held the spiritual keys and the moral authority within their community. Micah was a young parishioner, a member of the youth group. Third, the role integration. Micah initially worked as a nanny for the Miller children from J.P.'s first marriage. This allowed J.P. to establish control over her in a domestic environment, gradually blurring the lines between their professional, spiritual, and personal lives. Experts in grooming and sexual violence classified this dynamic as predatory. Micah's sister Sierra Francis publicly stated that Micah was groomed by her future husband. Legal documents filed later by J.P.'s first wife, Allison, confirm that the affair between J.P. and Micah began while she was still underage and while he was still married. This confirms that Micah initially became a victim of sexual exploitation, which J.P. then formalized and masked through marriage. The wedding in 2017 was the formalization of control. Micah's identity was completely subsumed into the structure of Solid Rock Ministries. She became the worship leader. She became the graphic designer. She became the youth ministry leader. She was the pastor's personal assistant. This created an ecosystem of total control. Micah had no private space. Her spiritual identity became dependent on the approval of her husband, pastor. Any conflict at home threatened her divine mission. Her professional life was tied directly to the church. Financial dependence meant that leaving the marriage also meant losing her job and her entire professional identity. Her social identity was the pastor's wife, demanding an image of perfection and complicity. JP later testified that he forbade her from even taking out the trash, justifying this as protecting the reputation of the ministry. This total integration is textbook for cult structures and abusive relationships. The victim's selfhood is systematically dissolved into the identity of the abuser and his mission.
Act 2. The Anatomy of Coercive Control. In the months leading up to her death, Micah's life transformed into a psychological thriller. She was the protagonist, being systematically hunted by her own husband. The central mechanism of this terror was coercive control, a strategic pattern of behavior designed to eliminate the victim's autonomy and isolate them from all sources of support. The conflict escalated dramatically in October 2023. Micah filed for divorce, an act of extreme courage given her isolation and dependence. However, the case was dismissed in February 2024, likely due to immense psychological or even financial pressure from J.P. Miller. In that very same month, J.P. Miller initiated a devastating act of abuse. He secured a forced commitment of Micah to the Weaponized Center for Mental Health. This is medical gaslighting used as a weapon. J.P. Miller began circulating serious psychiatric diagnoses, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, to systematically discredit his wife. Micah's attorney, Regina Ward, later asserted that J.P. had subjected Micah to forced treatment, including lithium and unwanted testosterone injections. This was chemical and physical abuse disguised as care. By manufacturing a public and private narrative of a crazy wife, J.P. Miller ensured that any truth Micah spoke would be instantly dismissed. It was a classic preemptive defense. The abuser diagnoses the victim before the victim can diagnose the abuser. Micah's life became an invisible prison managed by technology. She repeatedly discovered GPS trackers on her vehicle. In March 2024, Micah reported the first tracker found by her mechanics. Weeks later, in late March, a second device was discovered. This created a technological panopticon, the chilling feeling of constant, invisible surveillance. Micah knew her every move was tracked and logged. J.P. Miller, according to Micah, used this data for surprise appearances, demonstrating his omnipresence and total, inescapable control. The control then escalated to physical sabotage, intended to immobilize the victim and prevent her escape. Micah reported to police that a metallic object, a tire deflation device, had been inserted into the tire of her car. She also reported finding a razor blade. This was not a random act of vandalism. It was a clear act of separation assault. The psychological message, "I control your movement, and your attempts to leave will be physically dangerous." The psychological pressure was relentless and targeted. At one point, J.P. Miller confronted Micah at a gas station. Micah filmed the encounter, asking him to move away, to which he replied with chilling threats to publish compromising photos of her online. His phrase, "Do you want to go to jail? They'll be on Facebook in a few hours." This demonstrates the calculated use of blackmail as an instrument of control. Beyond the threats was the financial and emotional starvation. Micah's attorney reported that J.P. Miller had cut his wife off from financial resources, seized her personal belongings, and actively tried to turn the children against her. Finally, the ultimate emotional manipulation. In text messages released by the family, J.P. wrote to Micah, "My blood is on you. All you had to do was come home." This is suicide baiting. The abuser shifts the responsibility for his life onto the victim.
It is a final, cruel manipulation designed to instill crushing guilt in Micah for attempting to pursue her own freedom. Despite this systematic campaign of documented persecution, the trackers, the tire slashing, the threats, Micah contacted the police at least 14 times between February and April 2024. And yet, the police never made an arrest. They repeatedly qualified the disputes as civil matters or cited lack of direct evidence. This highlights a critical failure in the legal system, which often fails to recognize coercive control as a criminal offense until the moment physical harm occurs. Micah did everything right. She recorded the evidence, called the police, and retained an attorney. But the system failed her.
Act 3. The Terminal Phase. April 2024 was the point of no return. Micah had taken definitive steps toward freedom by filing for divorce and obtaining a no-contact order. Paradoxically, the moment a victim attempts to leave is the moment they are in the greatest danger. Let's reconstruct the final 48 hours of Micah's life. Micah had confided in her family, "If I am ever found with a bullet in my head, it was not me, it was JP." This statement, made while she was alive and fighting for her sanity, became the core of the investigation after her death. On Saturday, April 27, 2024, the timeline is precise. At 11:38 a.m., Micah leaves her residence in Myrtle Beach. At 12:12 p.m., Micah enters Dick's pawn shop. Surveillance footage shows her calm, focused, and utterly composed. She purchases a handgun. This composure contradicts the stereotype of suicidal agitation. She then drives an hour to Lumber River State Park in North Carolina, a remote, heavily wooded area. At 2:54 p.m., the critical moment arrives. Micah places a 911 call. The audio of this call is a unique psychological document. Micah's voice is utterly calm, devoid of trembling or hysteria. She asks the dispatcher, "Can you trace my phone's location?" The dispatcher confirms, "I see you in Lumber River State Park." Micah replies, "Okay, I am here. I am going to kill myself, and I just want my family to know where to find me." The psychological interpretation of this call suggests terminal lucidity or a final, chilling resolve. She is no longer fighting, she is executing a final, tragic plan. Her primary motivation for calling was altruistic, to protect her family from the pain of uncertainty. She knew JP could manipulate her disappearance, so she seized control of the discovery of her own body. This was her final, desperate act of care. This brings us to the core conflict, the provoked suicide hypothesis. Technically, the gun was fired by Micah, confirmed by J.P. Miller's solid alibi. He was at a sporting event in Charleston, hours away, with his car recorded by highway cameras. This rules out the theory of direct murder by J.P. However, psychologically, Micah was driven into a situation where death appeared to be the only way to permanently stop the relentless, soul-destroying persecution. Her will, her perspective, her very ability to perceive reality was so systematically destroyed that she had reached perspecticide, the killing of perspective. Her statement, "If I am ever found with a bullet in my head, it was not me," is not a lie. It is the articulation of her psychological reality. She knew her physical death was the only way to permanently escape the mental prison J.P. Miller had built for her.
The pastor's performance and the legacy. J.P. Miller's behavior following his wife's death became the subject of intense analysis by criminal psychologists and behavioral experts. His actions served as the final, chilling piece of evidence, a detailed portrait of a deep pathology incompatible with sincere human grief. Less than 24 hours after he was notified of his wife's death, J.P. Miller made a remarkable decision.
He took the pulpit at Solid Rock Ministries. He appeared perfectly composed. He was joking briefly during his sermon, establishing a false sense of normalcy. Then, at the very end of the service, he asked his shocked congregation to stand. He delivered his shocking announcement. "I got a call last night. My wife passed away. It was self-induced, and she was not in North Carolina. I ask you to leave the church quietly and not discuss this." Let's dissect the psychological markers of this moment. 1. Absence of grief. The total lack of visible shock, sorrow, or emotional congruence was jarring. A man whose wife has just died, by any means, should be in profound shock. Miller was not. 2. Control of information. His statement was a tactical strike. He immediately dictated the narrative. It was suicide, it was her fault, and I, the pastor, command you not to discuss it. He was locking down the information before the police or the press could intervene. 3. Narcissistic focus. He spoke about his grief and his efforts to help her, positioning himself as the primary victim and the martyr who suffered for his wife's mental struggles. In the following days, Miller performed his grief for the cameras. A video emerged from a memorial service where Miller recounted visiting Micah's body in the morgue 4 times. He stated, "I tried to raise her from the dead. I lay down beside her and kissed her. I thought she would wake up." This is not a romantic expression of love. This is an act of magical thinking and a profound manifestation of a God complex. For a narcissist, the death of a partner is the ultimate loss of control. His attempt to resurrect her was not an act of love, but a pathological refusal to accept a reality where his power was not omnipotent. He was trying to cancel her death just as he had tried to cancel her divorce. At the public funeral on May 5th, Miller delivered a eulogy that shocked many of the attendees and behavioral experts. He made strange, ill-timed jokes. He made cold, bizarre comments on her body. "She was beautiful when I met her." He consistently emphasized her mental problems, publicly absolving himself of any moral or psychological responsibility for her death. The institutional decay surrounding J.P. Miller was swift and brutal. A massive public protest movement, #JusticeForMicah, organized protests outside the Solid Rock Church. People wore purple ribbons, the symbol of domestic violence awareness. Under intense public pressure and scrutiny, Solid Rock Ministries officially dissolved in November 2024. J.P. Miller immediately began liquidating church assets, suggesting significant financial maneuvering. 2 parcels of land, previously valued in the millions, were sold to another church for a symbolic $5 each. Other assets were quickly sold for over $2 million. This was a clear attempt to shield assets from potential civil lawsuits and criminal forfeiture. The legal system finally began to move. On November 1, 2024, FBI agents raided J.P. Miller's Myrtle Beach home. This was a critical escalation. While the official investigation focused on financial crimes and potential interstate domestic violence due to the documented stalking crossing state lines into North Carolina, the message was clear. The system was finally treating him as a serious suspect, forcing him to defend himself against federal law enforcement. In 2025, Miller went on the counterattack, filing dozens of lawsuits against activists, bloggers, and protesters. This is a classic tactic of the abuser: attack as a defense, attempting to silence dissent through costly legal action. But his tactics failed. In August 2025, a jury delivered a humiliating verdict in a lawsuit against a former church member. Miller was awarded a symbolic $100 in damages, while the counterclaim against him resulted in a $3,400 judgment. The courts publicly confirmed that J.P. Miller's campaign of intimidation was over. The most damning evidence of his lifetime pattern came later. New civil lawsuits were filed against both J.P. Miller and his father, Wayne Miller. A victim alleged a pattern of sexual assault by J.P. Miller dating back to 1998, when she was 15, and again in 2023, confirming a history of predatory behavior spanning decades.
The final tragedy of Micah Miller is the systemic failure to intervene. Micah did everything right. She documented the evidence, she contacted the police 14 times. But the system failed her because it could not recognize coercive control as a criminal offense. Micah's tragic death, however, forced change. The most important systemic result is the development of Micah's Law, Senate Bill S-588 in South Carolina. This bill proposes criminalizing coercive control itself, redefining abuse to include a pattern of isolating, regulating, and financially exploiting a victim, even if no physical punch is ever thrown. The advancement of this law has faced stiff opposition from conservative legislators who fear government overreach into family life. However, activists continue the pressure, arguing that had this law been in place in March 2024, police would have had the legal basis to arrest J.P. Miller when the trackers were discovered, potentially saving Micah's life. Micah's voice, captured in the digital records and the final 911 call, became a powerful testament against the system that allowed her to die. Her psychological legacy provides the final, most profound lesson. The question is not, why did she kill herself? The question is, why was her will so systematically destroyed that death became the only rational option for escape? Micah Miller's death was a provoked suicide. It was a rational, tragic choice made by a person who realized her abuser would never let her go, and the system would never protect her. Her final act, the 911 call to reveal her location, was her last desperate bid for control. It was a final message to her family and to the world. I died by my own hand, but I was killed by his control. The fall of the untouchable pastor became a clear warning to other abusers hiding behind the pulpit. The movement to criminalize coercive control gained global momentum because of Micah Miller. Her light was extinguished, but her legacy is the law.